Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a great morning tea break. I recommend to you the ARC stall down there at the back for some extra reading if you want to do so. I thought I have the chief with me, so I thought I'd direct my first question to you, Simon. Listening to your speech, you had an interesting, what I'd call a kind of a Venn diagram between the National Defence Strategy, but also, references in there to the relationship, between the soldier and the state, particularly the unique application of violence. So this also then brings me back to the recent experience you spoke about in Afghanistan and others, which then leads me to the Afghan inquiry and to the Royal Commission. Is there a Venn diagram between those three things about how we need to consider the way that Army relates to society and the society relates to Army, particularly going forward into the future?
Thanks, Peter. Look, I'd offer a few points in response. The first to say is that everything that our Army is doing in its comprehensive transformation today is directly related to and traceable to the direction that I've been given by our government and by the CDF in terms of the National Defence Strategy, which emanated from the government's commissioning of the Defence Strategic Review, which you were part of. The big idea behind our transformation is continual adaptation, and that is easy to say, but it requires a conscious and comprehensive rewiring of all aspects of our Army as a national institution, as a profession, and as a fighting force. So we've taken a comprehensive approach. We've rewritten our concepts, which describe how we will fight as part of an integrated force and alongside allies and partners. We've changed the way we're organised and the way we command and control the Army. We are delivering on time and on budget capabilities, and we have a number of lines of effort to ensure that our culture is also rewired. And that's where we are addressing the opportunities that arise from the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide, and then a companion body of work that I commissioned last year to do a comprehensive review and assessment of the state of the Army profession, our jurisdiction, our professional body of knowledge, and the great point that Risa made in her excellent address about the capacity to self-regulate, and specifically the issue of command accountability. And when I think about and talk about command accountability, I'm talking about my accountability as the accountable steward of our profession and as the Chief of Army, and the accountability of our senior leaders, our generals. And in fact, on Friday this week, Army's senior leaders, the generals and the Tier Charlie Regimental Sergeants Major, will gather over at the Defence Academy to continue our work in terms of assessing the state of our profession, and we are specifically looking at the issue of command accountability, our accountability for our Army and for our people. If I can flick back now to our response to the Royal Commission to Defence and Veteran Suicide, we're about 2 years into to execution now. 4 quick points in terms of our approach. The first is we have aligned it with our primary reason for being. That is to fight and win, to engage in combat operations with an enemy, win the fight, and return home to families and loved ones. Because to do anything else would see some sort of companion effort eventually atrophy in terms of attention, focus, and prioritisation. So our approach is at 3 different levels, and these levels and the research we've done, the work that we've drawn from the Royal Commission and a range of other efforts, studies and analysis inform the way that we infuse these 3 lines of effort or priorities, if you like, into all aspects of our army. The fundamental level is resilience. It is individual resilience, physically, mentally, and spiritually resilient soldiers. Because the same resilience that one needs in combat is the same resilience that one needs to face whatever life may throw at you, and is the same resilience that we all require come the day that the scaffolding of service eventually falls away. The second line of effort is around cohesive teams, and that is a focus on leaders and leadership, and in particular ensuring that we invest in and set our leaders, particularly our junior leaders, up for success. That includes approaching leadership with humility, which is founded in respect, with empathy, which is distinct from sympathy, but requires imagination and the ability to understand other perspectives in order to engage in a respectful contest of ideas, but also to ensure that we test our own thinking and ideas from a range of different angles. It's about being conscious of the power that any leader, from Lance Corporal to Lieutenant General, has over those that we are privileged to lead. And it's the conscious application of that power in support of our mission and our mates, our purpose and our people that we're focusing on in that line of effort around cohesive teams. The third line of effort is about policy and practice. So what are our organisational, institutional policies, and how are they applied, and making sure that there isn't a say-do gap between the two. Now, the Army doesn't have agency over those policies, so we've got to work with others across the ADF and across the department to ensure that what we say to our people and what's reflected in policy is their lived experience in its application. So that, I guess a very quick summary is how we are approaching those. The bit I didn't address directly was the Afghanistan inquiry. That work has been underway for well over a decade now. It is resident in the work we're doing on the state of the profession. And when I started as the Chief of Army, I set 4 strategic priorities for our Army. The central one is trust. It's trust in our own teams, trust with the society we serve, trust with the government of the day, and trust with our allies and partners. And that is deliberately with a view to understanding that particular inquiry and a range of other things meant that, in my view, trust in us, in our Army, was somewhat diminished. Trust is easy to lose. You lose it in an instant, and difficult to rebuild. So that's what your Army is doing every single day, is working to build and maintain trust with the society we serve, the government of the day, our allies and partners, and importantly, inside our own teams.
Excellent. Thanks. Risa, I'm going to go to you. Fascinating speech that you had, but I'm going to leverage off something from Simon Stuart, which he spoke about, the rapidly changing character of war, but that made me think, while you were speaking, the rapidly changing nature of society. So we're sort of dealing with these two things together. In your experience, and you drew on some of the studies you had, is that changing the way we have to think about civil-military relations? Do we have to move faster in our thinking and our actions around this type of stuff? Or is there a fundamentally reshaping because of, AI, foreign interference, all those things that you said that were pressures on a sort of a democratic view of civil-military relations? Are we at a crossroads, or is there something different we need to be doing or thinking about? Or is this, about reaffirming of the sort of traditional values of civil-military relations in a democracy?
Great questions. I would say that in some ways, these are perennial questions, and in some ways, there are new issues on the table. What's perennial is the debate about how much the military in a society should reflect that society, and how to, and sociologists debate this. My own particular view is that it's helpful for society to see themselves in the military and to be able to relate to it. It creates a bond and a sense of ownership to that. So in some sense, I think with changes in society and what that represents, values or what have you, negotiating that is an ongoing challenge or issue for militaries and isn't new in that respect. I think the point you were getting at with technology is where I do see some opportunities and challenges. In particular, I think there's lots of opportunities, speaking through the lens of societal military relations, for new forms of engagement, for familiarization, especially via sort of social media writ large. New ways to communicate to a public that may not know anybody who's serving in the Army. And I would say, in some ways, that's a challenge for services, for militaries in democracies to figure out how to do and engage in that communication effectively and appropriately. Senior leaders, in my experience, are somewhat sort of wary of social media, for example, and just like, we don't do that. And I think there's an art and some opportunity there. Having said that, I think there are also challenges in that, rumor can run amok, something negative can be broadcast quickly, and as I mentioned in my talk, there are interests involved in leveraging negative things. And, I think thinking about, we're not in a room of intelligence specialists, but one would hope that they're thinking about that and thinking about how to insulate and protect against negative things being percolated, even false things, and ways of influencing service members themselves, but also the public. So I think there are risks and opportunities, especially with the technology angle, but mostly I would say it's something that needs a lot of thought, a lot more thought than in my experience many senior leaders, defense officials are giving it.
So, a warning order to everyone in the audience. I'm going to come to questions. I have an iPad here with plenty of questions on it, but we also have roving microphones to go out in the audience. So if you're a bit technologically challenged, like I seem to be getting as I advance every year on my birthday, you can go the old-fashioned way of raising your hand and getting hold of a microphone to ask a question. But Evan, before we go to questions from the floor, I just want to get to you now. I'm going to give you a challenge. I might be throwing up more than you'll be able to consume in one go. But you're a regionalist, you work in the region, you do a lot of work on Southeast Asia broadly. We've spoken a lot about Australia and the US example and democracies, but it's a very diverse community of nations out in Southeast Asia. But when you look at that sub-regional grouping, is there any particular broad themes or lessons about the way that armies and societies interact in Southeast Asia that you can sort of highlight for us that in particular might be a bit different to the way we've been conceiving it so far today?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for the Australian Army for having me. I guess let me try to reflect on that question based on my reflections of the three keynotes this morning. I think first, certainly, from your talk, Peter, I felt that the Pacific War legacy for Southeast Asia never really ended. In fact, the echoes of the Pacific War continues to haunt Southeast Asia in different ways, from unresolved borders to the diversity of internal security threats and insurgencies that are still part of the security landscape in Southeast Asia. The second part, I think, that's relevant for the role of the armies is precisely because that legacy was never really resolved and over for Southeast Asia. The army's embeddedness, I think, in society, particularly their sort of role in politics, in policy making, in broader socioeconomic development, I think remains a strong legacy from that era. And that role of the army in particular is certainly something that many in Southeast Asia still has to struggle with. Sometimes at the extreme end, you have the cases of Myanmar, and you have a more professional situation in Singapore, but in middle is where most of Southeast Asia is. And I think that's where it remains a daily question about the role of the army in society. The second part, I think, and picking up from Risa's talk, is the role of civilian defense community that Risa highlighted as a sense of expertise in terms of defense policy making, sure, but also the confidence of the civilian government to govern is something that remains an open question. Many in Southeast Asia still feel that if you don't have a retired officer as your running mate, then you're not really going to run the country. If you don't have an army man to run a civilian food or a food resilience program, then you're not really running it. So the lack of, I think, civilian institutions as well as civilian expertise on defense matter is still an open question for many in Southeast Asia. And lastly, I think, picking up from Simon's call for dialogue, what I think is an unresolved set of questions for Southeast Asia is the presence of, rather than genuine two-way street dialogue, is often a series of monologues between the military and society, between the military and the political leaders, that I think four kind of interrelated questions remain unresolved. Firstly, in the age of geopolitical uncertainty, particularly in the Southeast Asian strategic theater, where maritime challenges from South China Sea, Taiwan, and others, should we not talk about less of the Army and more of the Navy and the Air Force to face geopolitical challenges? And I think this is still a key question for Southeast Asia. As I've said earlier, there's still the dominant service across the defense establishment and the policy establishment, which means the thinking is still very much dominated by the Army. The second set of questions is, given the threat diversity and the history, including the unfinished legacies of the Pacific War, what sort of future war do Southeast Asian militaries actually think about? And this is where I think it's interesting, because parts of Southeast Asia finds the answer in 1950s doctrine. A country as big as Indonesia has recently talked about what is known as the defense of major islands, which is not exactly a new set of ideas, but rather from the 1950s and 60s. And so are we, as a region in Southeast Asia, facing future war from an old mindset, just with a new technology? And certainly the recent border war between Thailand and Cambodia suggests those answers as well. The third, I think, big question for a dialogue is whether or not you can get militarization without politicization. And by militarization, I mean professional sense of effectiveness. Can you improve the quality and capabilities and effectiveness and efficiency of the military establishment without the accompanying politicization? Can you essentially have a mature Southeast Asian state sans the military? And I think that's a big question for dialogue that's not resolved. And lastly, and I think this goes very key to what you all have been reflecting as well, the issue of trauma and accountability. And I feel like many in Southeast Asia, given the threat diversity and the internal historical upheaval across different Southeast Asian states, the role of insurgents, a rebel group, violent domestic transitions, that set of questions around trauma and accountability, I think, is far from resolved, even if reconciliation has moved forward. So the reckoning on military history of these domestic trauma, I think, is also still up for dialogue.
Excellent, thank you. And I think it's beholden on all of us to remember that point. In the Pacific War, the Western Allies largely fought over the terrain that is now sovereign independent states that we need to work with and in partnership with, which is a completely different geopolitical sort of set of circumstances in the geography around Australia's sort of near north. Now, I said, I'm warning you out one more time. I'm going to go to my first question from here, and then I'm going to come to the audience. Someone has to be brave and put their hand up in the audience and go first. So think about whether you want to be a volunteer. This is the top question on my iPad here, but I think it's something I'm going to ask you all to briefly reflect on going down the panel, and I'll just start with you, Risa, and we can work down the line. The question is, what does a healthy relationship between Army and society look like? But interestingly, how do we measure whether we're going to achieve, if we're achieving that? So a bit of a two-parter there. You can each have a little slice of it. You don't have to give a comprehensive answer, or I'll ask for a sort of an initial slice or reflection from each of you. Risa.
Sure. So I think I've told all of you a bit of what I see as a healthy relationship, which is that mutual trust and respect, a stance of respectful scrutiny from the public to society. So I won't reiterate that too much. In terms of measuring that, that is a great question, and as an academic and a social scientist, one that I'm open to, I think that you would definitely, maybe start with just understanding or assessing knowledge about the military. What do people know about the Army? What is the baseline there? Maybe assessing questions of when you see survey research that talks about confidence in institutions, trying to suss that out. What is that confidence based on? What are the preconceptions that underpin that? Is that a solid foundation? Is that a brittle foundation, one that could be more fleeting for a particular army? Trying to sort of understand that foundation, and then figuring out remedies or interventions to try to grow those perceptions or those views in ways that are seen as constructive, that may promote that respectful scrutiny that I spoke about.
General?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. One of the four strategic priorities that I've set is telling our story, and that is fundamentally about communicating with the society that we're drawn from, exist to serve, and inevitably return to. And I think that that sits at a number of levels. I was having this conversation with some of the team from our junior leader fellowship. So your Army is in 157 locations, 157 communities around the nation, from the Torres Strait to Tasmania, and from Derby, the phenomenal team we've got up in F Troop in Derby, Kimberley Squadron of the Northwest Mobile Force, down to Holsworthy and Special Operations Command East, and all points in between. And the point I was making is, through what we say and how we act and how we are conceived in our communities, that is the places we live, in our neighbourhoods, in our sporting clubs, in our community groups, that actually is a really powerful way of communicating and connecting with the society that we serve. Any soldier that served during the bushfires or the floods or the COVID pandemic set an example and created an impression. In other words, they communicated an image, an impression to the communities that they were serving and assisting in their time of need. I think that's a really powerful way of communicating without saying a word, because it's communicating and leading by personal example. That is a really foundational aspect of communicating as part of the society we serve. And then there's things like this forum, where I think we've taken a pretty ambitious approach, but one that is, I hope, faithfully received as it's intended, and that is to make sure that we as an army are doing our part in a discourse with the other elements of society, because we exist to serve that society. I often use the term respectful contest of ideas, and that's fundamentally about listening to what others may have to say. Remember General James Mattis used to say, even a busted clock is right twice a day. And the point he was making is, even with those with whom we may never agree, you could possibly learn something. So it's about eschewing hubris, ensuring that we exemplify humility when it comes to ideas, knowing that none of us have a mortgage on all the right ideas, and that we might just learn something even from those with whom we may never agree. But I think a respectful contest of ideas is the fundamental foundation of communication, of a dialogue, and I use the term dialogue very deliberately because it implies that there needs to be listening on both sides. And then finally, to the point I don't have a great answer for, and that's how do you measure it? I'm sure there are, you could develop measures of performance and measures of effectiveness. I would just offer that I think it's evident when it doesn't exist.
So to quote the castle, it's the vibe.
Indeed.
Evan, some quick thoughts from you.
Well, I think certainly a couple of things would be ideal for me from the experience of Southeast Asia. First is what I would say as the presence of absence, which is if the army is less involved in day-to-day governance and socio-political affairs, I think that's a first good healthy sign, I think, for the growth of the state and the civilian governance minus the army, which is historically much more challenging. The second, I think, is what I would consider the need to have a loving-critic relationship between the society, the political leadership, as well as the military themselves. I think to say to Southeast Asian militaries that they should not have any questions about the direction of the state and policy seems a bit difficult. But on the other hand, I think the civilian leadership themselves should also have the ability to criticize the military as much as I think the society as well. So this triangular relationship, I think, is certainly key, that there is an open, as Simon says, a respectful contestation of ideas. But I think the starting premise to be able to have that, and this is my last point, is perhaps the need to grow strategic literacy across the defense establishment for sure, but also the political leadership and civil society. Without that sort of expertise that Risa talks about, and the need to have a loving critic relationship across all three key players, the political concordance between these three actors would be difficult. But I guess ultimately when it comes to measuring a healthy one, I don't think the outcome matters as much as the process. And I think right now the process is not really fully borne out in many parts of Southeast Asia.
Excellent. Now I'm going to go to the audience. We have a question in the front.
My question is for you, Professor Brooks. Colonel Michelle Mason, I'm at Defence People Group. Thank you for your Keogh Chair address. Going on from the discussion just now about measures and health, you highlighted a recent study looking at civil oversight of various militaries, and that one of the benefits found is that it has generally made military organisations more healthy. How did this study measure organisational health? You mentioned transparency and accountability. How can other measures be promoted, particularly in a constrained recruitment and retention environment?
Shall I answer? Yep. Oh. So the study that I cited by Steve Seidman and Dave Auerswald and Phil Lagasse, both US and Canadian-based academics, what they were looking at was how, especially legislative oversight and also governmental executive branch oversight, and they were looking at sort of how well the committee structures functioned, what was the level of expertise, what actually happened institutionally in the process of oversight. So it was really an institutional kind of focus that they adopted. I think that's important, but I would say organizationally, I think qualitatively we also need to look and understand, what's happening in those dialogues, and what are the sort of informal routines and conventions. Because a lot of times what happens, for example, to use the US case, how the Office of the Secretary of Defense operates under different administrations or even under different secretaries can vary a lot, while the formal structures are the same. And part of that has to do with how much there's efforts to consult the civilian side, bring that apparatus in dialogue with the military side, how much sort of emphasis is put on getting kind of constructive disagreement, if you will, how much sort of outcomes are meeting the problems that they're supposed to solve. And I think, so assessing organizational health is a complicated thing. And part of, I guess, what I would suggest too is, and one of the things I was trying to say is that sometimes we want to focus on the interpersonal level, and we want to, my example sort of just did that, and focus on what individual leaders might emphasize or value, or their own emotional intelligence, if you will. But I think it's also really important to think about process and structure and what the incentives those structures are creating, to create boundaries and continuity over time so that it doesn't just become reliant on what one individual does. And by institutions, I mean not just formal rules, but also the norms and conventions, which can actually be very robust and actually sometimes more powerful and more influential. Like what really happens, not what does it look like it happens. And so I guess my answer is, a lot of things go into assessing organizational health, and I would just encourage civilian leadership, which is where I think some of this stuff needs to start, to really invest in trying to think through that problem and how they are going to assess it and take ownership over that, as well as the military side.
So we have another question from the floor.
So, ma'am, thanks for your time today. Flight Lieutenant Pham from Defence People Group. I have a somewhat controversial question for the panel. As a way of improving civil-military relations, would it be a good idea for more defence members to be encouraged to be more involved in a private capacity, political activities? Now, there's two contexts for this. I've seen the US Armed Forces policy on this, which is particularly restrictive. Here in Australia, our policy is a bit more liberalised, fair and reasonable. A defence member is to strictly engage in political activities in a strictly private capacity. And I'm wondering, as a way of culturally getting people into the ability to healthily disagree, more members having been involved in political activities is a way of building those relations.
Do you want to have a crack at that, General Stuart, and then maybe ask for some reflections from our other panels about how it works in their countries?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. It's a very thoughtful one. I would offer a few things in response. I think a respectful contest of ideas can be had with our current policy settings. I think certainly from an Army perspective, our apolitical nature is something that needs to be protected because it is inherent in building trust in all four of the dimensions that I discussed before, within our own organisation, with the society we serve, certainly with the government of the day and with our allies and partners. So I listen with great interest to Evan's description and discourse there, and I think when you look at the way that our system works in Australia, the apolitical nature of our military is something worth us protecting, both in reality and also in perception. Thanks.
So I might go to you, Evan. How apolitical in your country is the military, and how does that sort of functionally work in comparison to what General Stuart just explained?
Sure. Maybe if I speak a little bit more closely from the Indonesian historical experience, certainly going back to the 1950s, the Indonesian army themselves had their own political party. And so because of historical reasons, certainly Indonesian military have reached the point that they don't even allow military officers to vote because they want to be trying to be a more depoliticized armed forces, because the idea that that the military is only one out of several competing political actors were seen as disastrous back in the 1980s and before. And certainly my broad response to the question about political activity based on the Indonesian experience certainly would be yes, but under some very strict conditions. One, certainly, as we all know, the military is also a reflection of the maturity of the societies in which they're formed. And so one, I think for the political maturity, in the case of Indonesia, whether or not the Indonesian military soldiers and officers can vote, I think is the first sign of maturity. Second, of course, the maturity of the civilian institutions themselves, the political party system, whether or not you can be political but not partisan, and that you make a separation between statesmen, set of concerns versus purely partisan politics. These are all things that I think would be in high bar first as a precondition before you can easily make the judgment. But lastly, and I think this is probably more unique for the Indonesian army in particular, which is I don't think the Indonesian army should be involved in political activities as long as the territorial command structure remains in place. In fact, the growth in the territorial command structure across the Indonesian archipelago down to the village level, I think creates the potential of political challenges down the line if there is a directive from the top. And so you can be political as a private citizen and so forth and so on in your voting and in your ability to articulate political preferences. But once you're part of a structure that allows you to be physically present across different levels of governance in the country, your organization, I think, will always have potential for political role in those particular areas. And this, I think, is the big challenge for civil society as well as for the political leadership in Indonesia.
Risa, maybe can you explain how does it sort of work in the US?
In the US, yes, certainly, and I do think it's quite different for societal reasons and institutional reasons and the structure of the government here and lots of differences there. So I'll just speak a little about in the US. So there is a Department of Defense regulation that limits the political activities in which active duty service members can engage, also applies to reservists and guard members in different ways, not to veterans, so people who've only not retirees, but veterans, people who've served for a short time. And those generally pertain to things directly related to or adjunct to campaigning. So, for example, you can have a small bumper sticker on your car. You cannot, as a service member, you cannot plaster your car with bumper stickers. You cannot have a campaign sign on base if you live on base. You can write, you cannot actively campaign among other service folks, things like that. I think all of that is geared toward maintaining helping internalize norms, and I spoke a minute ago about the importance of informalities and convention, internalize expectations among service members that they do stand apart, not above, but apart from a political process. And it's also to help maintain the trust of society in that the public then doesn't, the public continues to see the military as representing all of them and not as siding with one faction or another, because most of the public, if they see somebody in uniform, which is prohibited, you can't go to a campaign rally in uniform, for example, if they see that, they think, oh, the Army likes XYZ. They don't think so-and-so is interested, they don't make that distinction. So it's about protecting the institution's impartiality and that perception of impartiality. I think that where it gets more interesting, or where there is a little more controversy, is when you get to questions about, say, senior leaders or GOFOs, senior officers speaking out in public, and what that should look like. Because, and I guess I'll elaborate a bit on that. There is a sense that it is important, and I personally believe that those folks have expertise and experience, and as long as they're speaking from their own expertise and experience, that can help educate the public. It does, so for example, a foreign policy issue or something that they've experienced, or an issue of organizational health, something like that, but you can probably already see how that could also be fraught. And it requires a remarkable amount of political awareness, which is a way undervalued attribute of cultivating a profession, of the military profession, because it requires understanding the lay of the land in domestic politics and not saying something that appears neutral, but that is intersecting domestic controversy, or not saying it in a way that actually is, can be perceived or appear to be partisan. That is an art form, and I would say sometimes some do better than worse in the US in this. There's also some debate about this. Some people really think that it should be extremely rare. Some people think that retired officers should be saying all sorts of things about domestic politics today, for example. I guess the last thing I'll sort of add to that, which I think is Australia's good fortune, is in my perception, sorry I keep hitting the mic, is that you haven't experienced or not experiencing the kind of polarization that is happening in a lot of other democratic countries. And that gives a lot of breathing room for these opportunities to speak to the public, for senior leaders to do that. When there is that intense polarization, everything becomes contested. So that neutral ground that you might try to strike is really absent. And that makes it much harder, and is sort of one of the negative byproducts of polarization and domestic political controversy, is that the military leadership retreats because they just don't see, well, how can I talk about anything? One side or the other side is going to think it means X, Y, Z, even if I don't intend it that way. And so you have that good fortune, and I would suggest to you that's a real opportunity to have that kind of conversation and take advantage of that.
So I'm going to ask apologies to Russell and in the audience, because I'm going to take your question, which is directed at me. I'm going to twist it around into something else and then direct it to the Chief of Army. So Russell talks about how I mentioned in my talk about the concepts of civil society, which the first and second Anzacs had, particularly around mateship, resourcefulness and humour. One of the things about the second AIF, as I said in my speech, is that they were the sons or relatives of the first AIF and had grown up with an understanding of that sort of citizen army experience. If we had to kind of mass mobilise the civilian population into the army today, General Stuart, we don't have that lived memory, so to speak, of that mass citizen army experience. So we could talk at depth. There's plenty of people obviously in the room who probably maybe even were working on how we will functionally do that. But how would we do that from that army and society point of view? What are the sort of modern contemporary values and concepts you think we'd have to work on to generate that kind of connection if we suddenly had to have another mass citizen army built out of the professional force that we have today? where would you start?
Thanks, Peter. Well, we start here today because this is about a dialogue between the Army and the society which we exist to serve. But to both Risa and Evan's point, I think you mentioned the Trinitarian approach. There's society, there's our elected representatives, and then there's the military in this discussion. So in an era of great power competition, where defence and security is once again, and I would add historically consistent, a whole of nation endeavour, I think it's fair to say that most Western democracies in particular, who've enjoyed the so-called peace dividend, are probably not match fit for that transition back into an era of great power competition. And indeed our National Defence Strategy and the strategic review that was based on it said as much, and gives some pretty clear direction on how the whole of government might act. It talks about national resilience, and it also gives some very clear direction to the ADF about the kind of force it needs to be, and some very clear direction to the Army, which we are moving out on. So I think in what Evan has very usefully described as a trinity, the dialogue between elected representatives, and I'm not, regardless of political persuasion, but elected representatives and those that they represent, I think is a really key part of one sort of diode of that dialogue as well. So today is a way in which the Army can fulfil, at least in part, our obligation to that contest of ideas, respectful contest of ideas, and a dialogue with the society that we serve. And we're doing it very deliberately here in the Great Hall of Parliament House, because I think it brings together citizen, state, and the military that represented. So I think it needs to be a set of dialogues. Ultimately, we serve our nation, we serve the government of the day, we exist to serve the society. It's up to the society we serve, through their elected representatives, to make the determinations of, who are we as a nation in the 21st century, and those sorts of questions, I think, drive foreign policy, economic policy, and certainly defence and security policy. It's our job to ensure that we are enacting that policy and the direction. So I guess in short, we're part of a broader whole of nation endeavour, and we frankly take our marching orders from the society we serve through the voice of those that they seek to elect.
Yes, so I do note that CPERS is in the front rank down here, and if we went to mass mobilisation and things to our elected political representatives, her job might be made far, far easier than it has been in the last couple of years. Do we have another question from the audience? Right down the front.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's James Groves. I work in Land Capability Division in Army Headquarters. And Peter, your point just now on mass mobilisation may actually be pertinent to my very current interests. And that is that we know that there are certainly historical patterns and more contemporary emerging trends with regards to the role of religion in democratic societies. I'm keen to hear the panel's perspectives on what role they think religion may play in the future of civil-military relations in Australia.
It's a good question. That's the role of religion in civil-military relations. And I won't, James, ask Risa and Evan to necessarily comment on Australia, but I might get them to reflect on, on their own countries, what I suppose the role that, you know, the intersection between the army, religion, and the state sort of plays. Maybe I'll start with you, Risa, about sort of the US experience, and then...
You know, it's an interesting question. It's not a question that I get often. And maybe that's a reflection of, with all of the civ mil issues that the US has grappled with and continues to grapple with, that maybe that isn't one that we grapple with so much. You know, I think that ultimately, you know, it is important to represent and provide spiritual sustenance to those who are seeking it, and that the chaplains, etc., that provide that, you know, the best thing they can do is do that, and just not, and do that in an egalitarian sense. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you. It's just not something that I have, it's not a controversy for once, at least for the most part.
Any reflections, General Stuart, on the sort of Australian Army's experience of religion and the intersection between these areas?
Big topic. I'm not going to thank you for the question either, Jimmy. Come and see me later. But look, what I'd offer though, I don't. Again, going back to my last response, this is a question for the society that we serve, and I think certainly in the case of Australia and most Western democracies, if you look at societal values, our codes of law, the way that our institutions work, they're fundamentally founded in a Western Christian tradition, which more or less, depending on where you sit on religion, mirror fundamental, universal human values. So I don't think it's a question about civil-military relations. Again, we take our mark and our marching orders from the society we serve. That's distinct from religious practice of those who serve. And we have soldiers from, I think, most of the monotheistic religions, and certainly a range of others. So again, not a question I've actually thought about in great detail, but I do think it's fundamentally a question for the society that we serve in terms of what role religion plays, and how are religious beliefs written into our constitution, our legal practice codes, the way our institutions are formed, and their relationship with government and society.
Evan, any sort of quick thoughts?
Sure. Again, very interesting question, and one that, like Risa, I haven't really thought about this in deeply. So excuse me for less than developed thought responses, but I think one sort of starting premise for civil-military relations has always been the fluidity between society and the military. So the division within the society could spill over into the military and vice versa. And so religion, I think, in that sense, is one current that could be both positive and negative, depending on the leadership of the day. It can be used to foster a sense of inclusion and tolerance amidst diversity. And certainly for the case of Southeast Asia, where a lot of the processes of nation and state building are not yet completed, religion is an important feature of that societal features, of that societal fault lines. And so in some cases, religion could be mobilized for less than ideal purposes. In other features, the ability of some militaries in Southeast Asia to make sure that the practices of the service members protect that sense of diversity and tolerance could also be an important role model for the rest of different civilian institutions in which those kinds of questions are still not yet resolved. So it's not entirely clear that, as Risa says, being apart but not above also applies to religion in both society and the military, because I think they do sort of spill over and into the military. So in that sense, is religion a central feature for morale, cohesion, and the fostering of diversity and tolerance that becomes a model for the rest of society? That's a possibility. In a society like most of Southeast Asia, where that process is not yet completed, I think that could be useful. But on the other hand, given the history of Southeast Asia, where questions of religion can be turned outward and be used in or mobilized in less than ideal purposes, I think that that could also be a dangerous slippery slope as well. So, but the point is, I think it's a relevant question. It's not one that we should sort of isolate the military from society for, but it's certainly not one that's well researched or well understood.
Right, we're going to have a very short period of time left. I'm going to ask one more quick question. I'm going to go to you, Risa, because you are the Keogh chair and you are our big visitor from overseas. And I'm actually going to really put you on the spot, so it's a good question. So the question is, is there a country where, based on the criteria you outlined in your speech, that the preconditions exist for a really healthy civil-military relationship? So when you lay out your criteria from the speech, is there an exemplar country or countries that you can say to us we should maybe spend some time looking into and learning from others?
So most academics don't focus on the good cases.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But why don't I'll take the out and answer it in the abstract of, what are the ingredients for that? And I would say part of it has to do with what's going on in politics, and I spoke a minute ago about the absence of polarization. I think a country that is able to navigate that is going to have the foundation for a healthy societal military relationship, because the military isn't going to be being inserted or inadvertently put in the middle of domestic political contestation. I would say on the military side, a developed professional ethic that is self-conscious and self-aware of what that profession means and has a culture of professionalism that understands and thinks about relationships with society, isn't too insular, and understands, and officers in particular, but others and service members in general, who know how to navigate and think about politics writ large, aren't afraid of it, don't sort of shield themselves in the sort of apolitical mantra so they're not engaging. I think that kind of professional ethic lays a foundation for healthy civil-military relations. I think some degree of exposure by the public, and I would say, the idea of popular culture and getting the public to think about the military, the army in a nuanced way, to go beyond the tropes, to the extent that that can be laid, that's really helpful. So the public tends to have particular stereotypes of people in the military, some good, some not so good, and to the extent that there is a fabric or an effort to try to create a more varied and humanized view, but also one that recognizes the unique job and role of the military, that's also helpful and foundational to achieving a positive societal military relationship. So no country has done all of that perfectly.
What I'm taking away from that is the Chief really needs to set up an Australian Army film and television program to ensure we get better into Australian popular culture on the television screens of those Australians in our community. Time is up for our panel. Can you please join me in thanking our panel members?